Please be seated. Eric, thank you. That was beautiful. Well, I just made a real strategic mistake. Andy introduces that I'm going to preach. I get thirsty. I go out and get a drink. And as I'm out in the hallway, several members walk by and say, "Hey, I just learned you're preaching. I've got something else I need to do." And then I come back in, and somebody comes by and says, "John, don't blow it." All right, amen. Thank you. Hey, I am really glad that you are here. Guests especially. Dr. Eric Joseph, a friend of mine who is a former president of a faith-based Christian college out in Portland, Oregon, is here. He actually came this morning to hear me preach, so it'll be the last time he does that, but I'm glad you're here, Eric. You know, I love this church, and I want to say on behalf of Oklahoma Christian University, this church for decades has been such an important part of our university. The support, the kindness, the love that you have for our faculty and our staff and our students that are here, it's just amazing, and I want to thank you for that. I can't think of a better church that would rather be on a corner close by where our students can get up from their dorm rooms and walk to church than this one. So God bless you, and thank you. Well, it's the Sunday of beginning Thanksgiving week. And you know what that means? That means that in just 5 days, we can begin listening to Christmas music in our cars with no guilt or shame. You know, that also means that in 5 days, we don't think, wow, their Christmas lights went up awfully early this year. And I am going to be able to put beside me that concern I've had at Lowe's. I went to Lowe's in early October, and I bought air filters for our house and my mom's house. And I walk in, and right there to the left are the displays, ghosts and goblins and skeletons right next to Christmas trees, reindeers, and snowmen. And it just did not seem right to me at all. You know, this is the time of year that a lot of folks think it's the most wonderful time of year. It's time for family. It's time for friends. It's time to get together and celebrate and gift gifts and to sing Christmas carols later and to think about those special, special things, including the birth of Christ. For others, well, painting as it is the Griswolds in Christmas Vacation. Or maybe you think that everybody else is having a better experience than you are. Yours is not that hallmark experience that you seem to see on the TV channel. But for some others, this is a lonely time because maybe for the first time, or again, there's an empty seat at the table. It's a sad and a lonely time. And our holidays, often as wonderful as they are for many of us, they can spike loneliness among others. Now, I want you to think to yourself, when have you felt really alone? For me, that was pretty easy to think about. Several times that I feel alone, and maybe there are times similar to when you might have felt alone. I remember once I got on a bus, a Trailways bus in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I was a college student. I needed to go to Seattle to begin a semester. And I looked and saw how much it cost to fly. It was $250. And I saw that I could get there on Trailways for $99. And so I chose Trailways. I went to the 4-lane in Tahlequah and went to the bus station. It's really not a bus station. It's a diner/hair salon. It was a bus station about 5 minutes a day. And my girlfriend, who is now my beautiful wife, Darla, and my mom and dad were there to see me off. And I climb up on that Trailways bus, and 62 hours later, I arrived in Seattle. And in the middle of both the nights that I was on that bus and unable to get comfortable, unable to sleep, thinking about who are these weird people on this bus, who is this weird person on this bus, I felt really lonely. By the way, it was on that trip When I did the calculation, I was saving $2.43 an hour being on that bus. It was not worth it. But sometimes in the middle of the night, you might feel especially lonely, or you might even feel lonely around lots of people. I love the Oklahoma City Thunder, and I know many of you all do as well, for lots of reasons. But let me give you another reason to love the Thunder. Of all the major league teams in football, basketball, baseball, and hockey, the Oklahoma City Thunder are the only organization that has a pre-game prayer before every home game. Now, how great is that? I've had a chance to lead some of those prayers, generally one a season. One year they made a mistake and they invited me to lead 2 prayers during that season. And so every year I gave here's my confession. I gave the exact same prayer. You have 20 seconds. You want to get a good prayer in. So I had a prayer that I could do in 20 seconds. It worked well. But this one year, I was giving a second prayer 2 weeks after the first prayer. And so I knew I couldn't use that first prayer because I knew that 18,000 people would remember it. Well, yeah, that was a mistake. But I didn't want to be known as just being a one-prayer pony, okay? I wanted to have another prayer. And so I came up with another 20-second prayer. And if you've been at a Thunder game, this is how it plays out. Both teams are still warming up on both sides. They escort out the person who's going to lead the prayer and the group that's going to do the national anthem. The players begin to assemble. The Thunder there on the left lined up, the bad guys on the right lined up. I am taken out to center court. There is a panel of people with cameras in front. The announcer says, "Ladies and gentlemen, please stand." Everyone stands. They get quiet. People take their hats off. The light dims. The spotlight hits center court. The announcer says, "Who is leading the prayer?" And it gets quiet. And there I am. And I freeze. I cannot remember my 20-second prayer. I can't remember how it starts. I can't remember what's in the middle. I can't remember I know how to finish it. I say amen, okay? But that's all I knew. And you've gone into a room and you thought, what am I doing in this room? Or you've had a conversation and you want to say something and you forgot what you were going to say. But I'm doing that in front of 18,000 people. I feel very alone right there. So my mind is racing and I go back through, okay, what are some prayers I know? And parents, be careful what you do, because I glommed on to that first prayer that my mom taught me over 60 years ago, and I almost, in front of 18,000 people, said, "Now I lay me down to sleep." But I didn't, and I got a prayer out. The Thunder did not invite me back the next year. That shows wisdom on behalf of the organization. But sometimes we can be lonely in the middle of lots and lots of people. Sometimes we might feel alone when we feel that someone is arrayed against us. So 2 weeks before the pandemic hit with full force, we had an incident. One of the employees of the university had done something inappropriate at a school nearby. It was a recruiting effort that went wrong. And boy, the local media got hold of it, and it became a local news item. It became a state news item. It became a national news item. I learned that it became an international news item. If anyone ever tells you all press is good press, that is not the case. My team decided that the next Monday I needed to go to this nearby high school and apologize, and that made a lot of sense to me. So we made arrangements for that. Just as I'm leaving campus that morning, my PR director tells me, "John, whatever you do, don't talk to the media." My apologies to journalists and media folks that are in the audience, but that sounded like really good advice to me. I get in my car, I drive to the school. At this particular school, when you come off the main road, you have a long straightaway. It only goes to this school. And as I'm driving on, I look up and I realize there are 2 local TV stations have their trucks on this road. And I'm pretty naive. I think, well, that's a coincidence. I get to the parking lot, I get out of my car, and I'm walking toward the entrance of the school, and I realize that 2 men with cameras and 2 reporters with microphones have planted themselves right in my path. And I remember the advice I was given: do not talk to media. But I also remembered, have you ever been watching the news and somebody is indicted and they're going into a federal courthouse and they're trying to avoid the press? They hide their eyes, they wear a hat, they don't make eye contact. That doesn't look good. And so I stepped up to the media and I talked to them for a minute, had no idea what I was saying, and then I went inside to talk to the students. What I should have said when they said, "Mr. deSteiguer, do you have a comment on this?" Well, yes, I do. Now I lay me down to sleep. You know, to be alone or to be lonely can happen for a short period of time or for a long period of time. The statistics in our country are pretty amazing. 30% of adults say they are lonely. It's much more among young people. Those that are 18 and younger, 80% say they deal with loneliness. For the millennials, it's 73%. 1 out of 10 high school and college students say they are lonely every single day. I learned recently that because of the pandemic, loneliness has spiked by 10 times. 1 in 10 adults have clinical loneliness. That means some activity in their life is impaired because of their loneliness. Or they are so self-centered they can no longer think about the other person. It is all about them. And loneliness impacts us physically. It causes cognitive decline. It causes us to be more sick. Doctors say that it's very similar, mortality-wise, to smoking 15 cigarettes a day or being an alcoholic. I believe, brothers and sisters, that the deceiver, Satan, wants us to be alone and lonely. He knows that we are more vulnerable, we are weaker, we are not as strong when we are afflicted with loneliness. Well, there are lots of ways and lots of situations that cause loneliness. I want to talk about 3 lies that I believe the devil wants us to believe about loneliness. And here's the first lie. The first lie is that you can do it. In fact, really, you must do it by yourself. Whatever that it is. A problem you're dealing with, a situation that you're facing, whatever it is, the devil wants you to believe that you have to go through it alone. In Exodus chapter 17, Moses faced this. Now, this is a pretty important time in the life of Israel. You see, they've escaped from Egypt. Pharaoh and his army has been engulfed by the waters. The people celebrated, but then shortly after that, the Israelites were like, "We're thirsty. Moses, did you bring us out here in the desert to die of thirst?" They finally find some water, and it's bitter. God tells Moses, "Throw this stick in it, and it'll become sweet," and it does, and they rejoice temporarily until they begin complaining again. "We're starving to death. Did you bring us out in the desert to die of hunger?" And God provides manna in the morning and quail at night. And the people continue to venture, and they get thirsty again and say, "We're going to die." And God tells Moses, "Walk a little bit further and strike this rock," and water came forth, and the people were satisfied again. Then you have Exodus 17. For the first time, something happens to the followers of God. It hasn't happened before. There were threats of it, but here it actually happens. The Amalekites, they come in and they attack the people of Israel near Rephidim, where Moses had struck the rock and water came forth. And so Moses says to Joshua, "Joshua, get some men and go and fight the Amalekites. Now, it's interesting, he doesn't say, Joshua, get the army together and go fight the Amalekites, because we didn't have an army yet. We probably didn't have much in the way of weapons. But Moses says, Joshua, go out and fight them. And Moses says, as for me, you see that hill? I'm going to go climb that hill, and I'm going to take the staff of God. The next morning, he goes to the top of that hill. Now, 2 men go with him, Aaron, his brother, and Hur. We don't know a lot about Hur, but he's referenced later as a leader as well. And in this situation, as long as Moses raised his hands, the Israelites were winning the battle. Now, I thought about maybe having a demonstration and seeing how long you could raise your hands. And if you could go 15 minutes, then I'd cut the sermon short. But I decided that would not be a good idea. So as long as Moses' arms were up, the Israelites were winning. But when he got tired and his arms came down, the Amalekites, they began to win. And finally, he got so tired that Aaron and Hur brought a rock that he could sit on, and then Aaron and Hur got on both sides of Moses and held his arms up until sunset. And that's how the people of Israel defeated the Amalekites. Moses could not do it alone. Moses needed somebody with him. Now, he learns that lesson again in the next chapter. You see, in Exodus chapter 18, Jethro, his father-in-law, sends word and says, I'm coming to see you, and I'm bringing Zipporah, your wife, and your 2 sons. Now, Jethro was a priest of Midian. Jethro had heard some of the great things that God had done for the nation of Israel, but when he arrives, it's like a big celebration with Moses. He and Moses, they greet each other, they go into the tent that Moses had, and Moses tells Jethro everything. And Jethro is so excited. He learns about how God, Yahweh, delivered Moses and the people from Pharaoh and the Egyptians. He learns about all the other happenings that occurred. And Jethro says, Moses, your God is the greatest of them all. And he sacrifices a bull. He has a big meal where Aaron and Moses and the elders of Israel come together. And it is a great celebration. And the next morning, Moses wakes up. He goes and takes his usual seat as judge. And he is surrounded all day by Israelites who are pleading their cases and seeking justice. And Jethro says to Moses, what are you doing? And Moses kind of assumes that the question is, like, what exactly are you doing when you're out there with those folks? And so he says, well, the people have disputes, and I am the judge, and I am deciding for them, and I am making all the rules. And Jethro says, that's really not what I'm asking. I'm saying, why are you doing it like that? You are absolutely going to wear yourself out, and you're going to wear the people out as well. Moses, you need to be representing the people to God. You need to be taking their disputes to Him. You need to teach them the rules and the decrees so they know how to follow God. And you know what? You need to appoint able men, men who fear God, men who hate dishonest gain, and let them be the judges of 1,000, 100, 50, or 10 people. And the simple cases, those men can handle. But the really complicated cases, they can bring those to you. And that way you can stand under the strain. And that way the people will be satisfied. Moses, you cannot do this by yourself. Moses took his advice. Moses appointed men, and he did just what Jethro suggested to him. Good advice from a father-in-law. Of course, the next thing Moses did was said, Jethro, thanks for being here. It's time for you to leave. And he did. But he took the good advice that came. Brothers and sisters, lie number one is, we have to do everything by ourselves. We have to face the giants by ourselves. We have to face our temptations, our struggles, our situations by ourselves. And that's what the devil wants us to believe. Here's a second lie. A second lie is not that you think you have to face something by yourself, but you believe there is no one to face it with you. The belief is, man, I am by myself in this situation, and there is nobody here to help me. 2 Kings chapter 6. It's a fascinating story. So, the king of Aram is warring against Israel. And he decides with his soldiers that they're going to make camp at this place so they can ambush the Israelites. So he says, this is where we're going to go, such and such a place, we're going to set up camp. Well, the prophet of God knows what is happening, and he tells the king of Israel, don't go to this place because that's where the king of Aram will be with his men. And so the Israelite king avoids that place. And that happens over and over and over again. Everywhere the Arameans are, the Israelites avoid that place. And finally, the king of Aram is just so beside himself, he gathers his direct reports and he says, who is the traitor among us that keeps telling them where we're going to be? And one of the men comes forward and says, King, it's none of us. It's the prophet of Israel. He knows your words, even those that are spoken in the most private of places, your bedroom. And the king says, find out where this man Elisha is, and we will capture him. Soon the word comes back, Elisha is at Dothan. And so immediately the king sets aside part of his army, men on horseback and chariots, and they go at night and they surround the town of Dothan. The next morning, Elisha's servant wakes up and he goes outside, and he is stunned and scared to death because surrounding the town is the enemy. And he rushes back in and he gets Elisha and he says, what are we going to do? And Elisha says, don't be afraid. There are a lot more with us than there are with them. And then Elisha prays to God, God, would you open the eyes of my servant so he can see the reality? And the servant's eyes are opened. He looks back out and he sees that the hills are covered with horses and chariots of fire surrounding and protecting Elisha. Sometimes we think we are all alone, and it's the furthest thing from the truth. Now, I got to tell you, I got to finish that story because a real interesting way that story ends. So the Arameans begin to advance towards Elisha. Elisha says, God, would you blind these men? And they're all blinded. And then Elisha goes to them and says, you're at the wrong town. You're on the wrong road. Follow me, and I will take you to the man you are seeking. And so they all follow him to Samaria. And apparently they go into Samaria, and they are surrounded by a much larger and stronger force of Israelites. And Elisha says, God, open their eyes. And their eyes are opened, and they're surrounded. And the king of Israel says, is it time for me to kill them? Father, do I kill them all right now? And Elisha says, no, let's feed them. And they have a big feast. They eat and they drink, and then the enemy goes home and the war is over. The second lie that the devil wants us to believe is that we are alone. And here's the third lie. The third lie is, man, nobody has gone through this like I'm going through this. This temptation, this difficulty, this crisis, nobody gets it like I get it, and so nobody can be there for me. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, There is nothing new under the sun. Or 1 Corinthians 10:13. Man, I loved this verse growing up. No temptation, some versions, no test has seized you but what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. And He's going to provide a way of escape so that you can stand up under it. Brothers and sisters, it's a lie to say nobody knows what I'm going through, nobody knows what I'm facing, and I'm lonely and alone because of that, because others have gone through it. Well, what does this mean for us? Well, first, a word or two for those who might be experiencing loneliness right now. And by the way, I am not a medical doctor. I am not a counselor. I am not an expert in any of this. I am just like you. Sometimes I'm alone. Sometimes I feel loneliness pretty deeply. What I do believe is that's what the devil wants me to feel. And I think Jesus was really in tune with this. In Luke chapter 10, do you remember when He sent out, we call it the limited commission, He sends out 70 or 72 of His disciples to go ahead into cities that He's about to go to make the areas ready for Him. And He sends them not out individually, He sends them out 2 by 2. And in John chapter 19, when Jesus is on the cross, one of the last things that He says, He looks down and He sees His mother, and He sees John the Apostle, and He loves them both. And He knows that at least for a period of time, His mom's going to be alone. And so He says to her, "Dear mother, behold your son, and behold your mother." God is on our side. Jesus is on our side. There are times that we need to ask each other for help. Man, I had a really wonderful conversation just a few days ago with some of our staff in the care and counseling ministry here, and what great work that they do. Brother McKnight and Jenny and Tasha, they do really great stuff. I asked him, okay, so when should somebody seek counseling? When should somebody say, hey, I need to go to a Christian counselor because maybe I'm having problems with loneliness or something else? And I kind of love the test he gave me. He said, well, John, really, if you've thought to yourself you need to see a counselor, and then you didn't go see a counselor, you need to go see a counselor. Okay, man, that makes sense to me. And there are other ways that our counseling ministry can help us. I'm looking forward, something called the Mental Health First Aid Kit is on their radar screen they will be producing and providing to us. What a blessing that's going to be for all of us, whether we are lonely or depressed or not. If you are lonely, seek counseling if you think you need it. Secondly, don't do what I do. Sometimes when I'm lonely, I really kind of decide that the best thing for me to do is to be by myself. I don't believe that binge watching Netflix is a good solution to loneliness, or doom scrolling, or staying away from people. Be with people. And remember this as well. You can't fix this alone. But the good news is you are not alone. You've got people who love you and care for you. Now, a word for those who might not be lonely right now. Odds are you're going to be lonely at some point. So remember, seek counseling if it's appropriate, be with people, and you are not alone. In 1938, a fellow had a dream. He woke up from his dream and he thought, wow, that's a great story right there. And so he immediately wrote the story. Now, his name was Philip Van Dorenstern. If you think John deSteiguer's a tough name to live with, Philip Van Dorenstern. He writes this story and he looks at it and he realizes he's not a very good writer. And so he puts it on the shelf for 5 years. Then in 1943, he's had more training. more experience writing, and he takes another stab at it. He pulls the story out, he writes it, he thinks it's really good, he gives it to his agent really likes it. The agent shops it to a bunch of publishers, and the publishers are unanimous in their praise for it, which is exhibited by the sound of crickets, because nobody wants to publish the book. And so Philip Van Dorenstern does what I guess maybe was the thing back in 1943. He made 200 copies of his story, and that was his Christmas card that year to his friends. Now, the story involved a guy named George Pratt. George Pratt grew up in a small town. George Pratt had always done the right thing, but his dreams were to do something else, to get out and travel the world, to be a huge success, to get out of town and make his mark. And he realized that that was never going to happen. And so he got depressed and he was lonely, and he even thought for a while at this time in the story that maybe the world would have been better off had he never been born. Now, the story keeps going, but I want to stop there. You see, this particular story found its way into the hands of the U.S. military. It's really interesting. At the time, the U.S. military was identifying small, encouraging, short stories that they could make many copies of and distribute to their men and women who were serving in the military to help keep their spirits up. And so this story, The Greatest Gift, made its way into the hands of many, many people who were fighting and serving our country during World War II. One of the guys was a fellow named Frank Capra. Frank Capra was a movie producer prior to the war, and he knew that he was going to be producing movies after the war. He fell in love with the story. He reached out to a friend of his, a guy named James. James was a B-24 Liberator pilot. He actually served in more missions than the average pilot could survive. James received numerous awards because of his service. Well, he was an actor also. And so Frank says to James, "Hey, have you read The Greatest Gift?" And James said, "Well, I haven't read it, but I've heard about it." And Frank said, "When the war's over, we're going to make this movie." And so in 1946, those two did release the movie. By the way, James, his really goes by Jimmy Stewart much more commonly. And the movie, It's a Wonderful Life. And in It's a Wonderful Life, it was small decisions made by George Bailey that actually changed the course of history for many individuals. And he never could see that until he thought it was all over for himself. Now, there was a postlude to this book, The Greatest Gift. The daughter of Philip Van Dorenstern writes a postlude, and she says, the power in this story is the apparent power of the insignificant act. You know, we wish we could stop the war in Ukraine, and the war in Gaza and Israel and in Africa. And we wish that we could tame inflation single-handedly. We can't do those things, but what we can do is make a difference in the life of each other. Matthew McConaughey wrote an autobiography. It's called Green Lights. And he tells a story that's really interesting and I think very illustrative for us. He had just made it big. He was now a big-time star. His face was on magazine covers. He had a lot of money that was coming into his bank account, and he realized that he wasn't really ready for all of this because he was making some bad decisions. He was facing temptation and opportunity, and he was not making good choices. He was losing himself. And he knew that he was moving away from that small-town, blue-collar roots of Uvalde, Texas, where he grew up. And he began to worry about who he was becoming. And he also had the imposter syndrome. I don't deserve all these things. He entered into a phase of his life where he began to read some spiritual items. And he was reading Thomas Merton. And he learned about this monastery in the desert of New Mexico. It was called Christ in the Desert. And he said, that's where I need to go. So Matthew McConaughey had a friend of his drive him to New Mexico and dropped him off on the road that had the dirt road that goes all the way to the monastery. His friend drives off. McConaughey has to walk 13 and a half miles on a dirt road to get to the monastery. He gets to the monastery, he knocks on the door. One of the brothers lets him in, takes him to a room, maybe kind of a cell that has a mat on the floor, and that is McConaughey's room. The next morning, he gets up and he goes on a 3.5-hour hike in the desert with Brother Christian. What a great name, okay? Brother Christian. And on this hike in the desolate desert with cacti and heat and sun and thirst, McConaughey pours out his heart to Brother Christian. McConaughey talks the entire 3.5 hours, and Brother Christian doesn't say anything. McConaughey says he took himself behind the woodshed, and they get back to the monastery, and they're sitting on a bench right outside of the chapel, and McConaughey, finally, crying, finishes talking, and he knows he's about to be rebuked and chastised and reprimanded, whatever Brother Christian says. And Brother Christian looks at him, and after being silent for about 4 hours, Brother Christian says, "Me too." Brothers and sisters, sometimes the best thing we can do for each other is to be present and to listen and to be vulnerable and to say, "Me too." At the very end of It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey is finally come back into his own. He opens a book that the angel Clarence has left for him, and in the book it says, "Dear George, never forget, no man is a failure who has friends." We will all go through the desert. We will all have difficult times. That's when we need to make sure that we are there for each other and not suffering from the loneliness that the devil wants us to suffer from. God bless you on the beginning of this holiday time. If there's any way we can serve you, if it's time to put on Christ in baptism, if you want to ask for the prayers of the church, would you please come forward while we stand and while we sing.